Dimitri, for the amazing introduction. All right. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the presentation. In case you didn't guess it, it was about time. So, I'm Ujwal. You can find me on GitHub or Twitter as Riza Kukin. Uh, I'm a compiler's hacker at Igalia. A little bit about myself, working on TC39 standardizing JavaScript and also, in different compilers in JavaScript land, just building more features and all the fun things you like. Apart from that, I'm a Node.js core collaborator, TC39 delegate working on Temporal, which is the proposal that we're going to talk about for 30-40 minutes today. And of course, I'm still a student. I'm sorry about that. And I'm a speaker. This last part is for myself. Thank you. A tiny bit about Igalia. If you don't know what Igalia is my employer. We're an open source software consultancy in Spain, and we build a lot of fun stuff that you probably like. And web standards is what I've been working on these days. And there's more interesting and really cool stuff that you probably don't like too much personally, but it's still there. A quick shout out to Bloomberg. Tech at Bloomberg has been sponsoring all of our work for Temporal for the last couple of months, for me especially, and they also sponsored all the time that I spent presenting this topic and writing this presentation. So thank you about that. And yeah, let's go back in time. Not a pun, just generally to understand what the problems are that we're dealing with. Let's go back in time and I welcome you all to Mountain View in California in 1995. And there's this thing that we all love and spend all our time and effort and self-esteem on, JavaScript. Well, back in the day, JavaScript was probably a Jira ticket. Uh, I don't know if Jira existed back then, but whatever was the equivalent at the time, I util date provided. Now that was fraught with issues, as I'd show you. Now, in that 1996 was when JDK was launched, and 1997 was when Java deprecated util date. It was so bad that the developer community could not take it for a year. And well, 2014 happened eventually, and Java introduced a new shiny date API that
Год, и в
introduced a
Java
bunch of
появился
better
новый
functionalities.
замечательный
It fixed
API.
a lot of issues, and is generally an amazing API to work with these days. As I've heard, I'm not a Java developer, uh, and if you go on Java, land and try to look for Java util date, you'll see all these blog posts all over the internet actually, which say, well, hey, if you're using Java util date, please don't because it's horrible. Uh, well, guess what? Uh, who's using Java util date still? And hint, that's not JavaScript developers. That's not Java developers. JavaScript still uses that API because that Java util date was JavaScript date, and we still use JavaScript date. And I mean, like, let's be honest, most of the people that I know who use date times in JavaScript use something like Moment.js or some other date FNS, some library like that, sorry, date functions. But, you know, JavaScript date still happens to be the building block of datetime functionality in the language, and everything is based off of it. So let's sort of analyze what's wrong about it anyway. Why am I so pissed about it? I mean, if you've done anything relating to date times in JavaScript so far, you already know this. I don't need to tell you about this. You're waiting for the second part of the presentation already. But let me if you're the lucky person who hasn't so far delved in JavaScript date, let me just quickly try to enumerate for you. And this, by the way, being very opinionated and very not exhaustive at all, a list of complaints that I personally have against JavaScript date. So first of all, limited time zone support. In JavaScript date, you have access to just two time zones. That is the local time zone and UTC, and that's it. That's just the two time zones that you're allowed to use. And you think about it, it makes a little sense. A little sense. If you're writing a purely client-sided application, right? I mean, eh, most 99% of the times you'll use either UTC or your local time. Well, that's not kind of the case with JavaScript anymore either. You see, internationalization and is the truth of the internet in 2020. Also, well, I mean, not to mention that JavaScript is using Node.js, which means that uh, can only process either UTC or the server's local time, which makes no sense. I mean, uh, you can't process a date in the client's local time. It's not something that can be done. Also, the things are even worsened, so to say, or the lines are even blurred by using something like Next.js or Nuxt.js or any sort of isomorphic web application framework, which does server-side rendering or, rendering where you don't know where the rendering is happening at all. So it's slightly complicated if you'll have access to the necessary time zone data or not. Uh, Moving on, yeah. So if you go see all these examples on Stack Overflow, people regularly talk about how to initialize the JavaScript data in a particular time zone. And well, moving on, yeah, unreliable parser behavior is one of the biggest problems a lot of people have with JavaScript date. I'm gonna tell you one thing. If you promise that you won't be super angry at us, which is until ES5, the JavaScript date parsing behavior was not even standardized. So it was completely implementation defined. The implementers like Google Chrome or Mozilla Firefox or Microsoft Edge could basically do whatever they wanted, and it was completely up to them and whatever APIs they used underneath it. Well, you see, the problem with that was that everybody came up with sort of their own formats, and at some point we had to sort of standardize that. The problem is that we still can't break the old format, so we still have to support it, and because of that, uh, a bunch of problems came up, as I'll show you. Well, you see, in case one, you parse some awkward format that is still supported by the browser, and because of that, it is parsed in the local time. Whereas in case two, that's the format that is now supported by the JavaScript spec, which only makes the problem worse because now the same date is being parsed in UTC. And now, like, unless you have so today you know what's wrong, but unless you had a good idea about why these things were the way they were, just why is this bug happening? A lot of developers would pull their hair out, or go to Stack Overflow. And you see, it's even not that Word has the different format. Any browser can support any sort of invalid ISO format. So if you see like case one is just the standard ISO format without zero, so it's no longer standard ISO, and that means that the browser interprets that in the local time zone, which is wild. I mean, you just forgot a zero while typing your string, and well, guess what? It's a bug. So what exactly is wrong here? Well, you see, right now the JavaScript spec accepts a subset of ISO 8601, which is pretty good actually. If you look at this subset, it's a rather sane subset. Sorry, American people, for using months before days, but uh, year, month, days, and then hour, minute, seconds, milliseconds, and lastly the time zone. Actually, not exactly the time zone, but like the UTC or not UTC. And you see, anything else is just implementation defined, and that's sort of the problem here. The problem is not this new syntax. The problem is that any syntax that does not adhere to this can still be accepted, and it's accepted according to the whims of the browser. The reason for this is we cannot break the web. Anything that already exists on the internet, any JavaScript code that already ran before ES5 needs to still run. And that's sort of the biggest constraint that we live in at TC39 and JavaScript in general, is that we can't break anything because JavaScript does not have any semantic versioning or anything like that. So, uh, yeah, we cannot break the web. I'm sorry about that. But thirdly, I would like to talk about mutable instances. Well, these days, I don't need to come to a JavaScript conference, I think, in 2020 and tell people why immutability is a good thing in general, right? But I mean, talking about dates and times, sort of a de facto date time expert these days, thanks to this proposal, I would say the dates and times are probably the worst when you're talking about mutability because you see, I'll show you a few examples. Actually, one example is that if you initialize a date, because you need to do a lot of arithmetic on dates, and you see, if you do arithmetic on dates, they can't be mutable because otherwise you'll just have all sorts of weird stuff. So you see, I initialize a new date object with 31st of January as the date, sorry, and I add 1 month to that, uh, and assign that to a new object. The problem is that because it was mutable, if you print out both the values, well, I mean, they're both changed. So you no longer have access to that old value, which you didn't want to change. So mutability, you need a lot of cloning and all that stuff to sort of move around this problem. But it's sort of universally decided at this point in JavaScript and especially the data science communities that it's probably one of the bigger problems that needs to be solved. Another problem that existed in the JavaScript data object back in the day when we started working on temporal was that it had a lot of unpredictable DST behavior. Fortunately for you, and fortunately also for us, this was actually a bug in the spec. So we made a PR, it's fixed, and things are slightly better now in accordance to this specific problem. So that's just a problem that existed with JavaScript date, not necessarily a problem that still exists, so to say, but yeah. Fifth option, the fifth is unwieldy computation APIs. As you saw from the last example, any computation that you need to do in JavaScript dates is sort of complicated, and that's not a great thing because see, it's not that hard to actually introduce computation APIs, and it would be really good if people can use straightforward APIs to add a day and add a week and stuff like that. Moving on to non-existent calendar support, the JavaScript date object just do not support any calendar apart from the standard Gregorian, sorry, calendar, and that's sort of an issue that needs to be dealt with. I mean, people out there, uh, not majority of the world still uses the Gregorian calendar as the only official calendar, but there's countries out there who use the Islamic Hijri calendar or the Hebrew calendar, and I mean, even if it's not the official calendar of a country, you might still want to use a non-Gregorian calendar for some reasons, right? So yeah, that's also a thing that does not exist in JavaScript 8 talking about it. So in short, I would say that the JavaScript data API is one, limited, two, unreliable, mutable, unpredictable, unwieldy. Not that doesn't make any sense as I moved on about it, but how do we fix this, right? I mean, I told you what the problem was, but I don't want to be a person who just talks about problems. So what are these solutions? How do we fix this? The first option that comes to everyone is let's hack. We're hackers. We are developers who like to write code, and let's try to hack into this problem. So what we do is we can add time zone support actually by adding factory functions to the data object, and we can sort of extend this approach to add support for calendars. And you see, if you realize what I'm doing here, you realize that it's sort of a watery approach because all I'm adding is just factory functions without actually showing you the insurmountable amount of code that we need to have to actually support the Hijri calendar, for example, or any other time zones and the kind of data that we need to do that. But we can potentially fix this problem, fingers crossed. And also, second hack would be we could simply, as I said, it's really easy to have APIs for computation, and we can simply add those APIs in actually. So we can add functions like add days, which just simply add days to a JavaScript date. It's not that complicated. We can add weeks that uses add days or something like that. It's my point is it's not that complicated. It's something that should be a part of the standard API. Now, if you think about this, it solves most of the issues apart from two. And uh, the two issues that cannot be solved are the parsing and the mutability, and that's because they break existing code. They're not adding anything new to the language. They're not adding anything new to JavaScript date. They're breaking or changing original behavior that some people depend on. And I mean, I make it sound like these two behaviors are completely outlandish, and maybe you kind of agree that it's sort of weird to use a custom format like that on JavaScript date parse. But I mean, at least talking about mutability, I know a lot of people who use mutability uh, for various reasons. I mean, I'm not judging them. Moment.js uses mutability of date object, exploits it, so to say, for their own gains across the code base. And we would agree that Moment.js is a nice thing to have. So, I mean, people are using these behaviors, and it's not something we can break them because we live by two things at TC39, as I said, and that is web reality and web compatibility. We have to accept the web reality, which is this is how things work on the web, and we can't break them. We need to be compatible all the time. So option two is let's use Moment.js. Let's use something that allows us to expose a better API, an alternate API, and use something like that. To quickly go over my list of complaints, let's say that Moment, just to say the very least, has amazing parsing capabilities. I mean, if you think the biggest problem that you have with JavaScript 8 is the parser, well, Moment has a lot going for that. Moment, I would say that Moment's parser is a solid 8 out of 10, maybe, because I'm reserving 10 out of 10 for something that you'll see soon. But it parses the full ISO 8601 format, which is the whole spec. I mean, literally the whole thing, including weeks format. I mean, what? It parses RFC 2822 time format. I'm sure you've seen that sort of format before. It gracefully falls back to date. So if you have a code base that uses date right now, you can incrementally update that without actually breaking the current behavior. That's pretty cool, I guess. As a goal, it parses Unix timestamps for all my nerdy friends out there. So you know who you are. And it also parses custom built formats. I mean, that is the edge of human imagination. What that is like do I need anything even more? And it even parses ASP.NET, not .NET JSON date. And I mean, if you're using ASP.NET JSON dates, then you probably have bigger problems to deal with. But I mean, congratulations, great for you, champ. Uh, Moment supports your format. Okay, great. So talking about the original problems, uh, you know, most of it solves the parser behavior issue. And well, I mean, talking about time zones, if you're using Moment.js, you can simply add a companion library called Moment Time Zone, and that would just transparently give you support for time zones. I mean, it's not as transparent as I make it sound. It's still, a good amount of bundle size. I mean, you need all that time zone data to make all the time zone computations, but it's pretty good. Uh, I mean, if you don't care about your bundle size increasing substantially. Well, you see, okay, let me rewind a little. Where did I go? Okay, so two problems still exist, which is mutable instances and non-existent calendar support. And may I add two more issues? So first of all, Moment does not use the Intel object, which is something that we added later to JavaScript for supporting internationalization of JavaScript date. Moment unfortunately came before that, and it had its own localization, internationalization APIs. So by the virtue of being too fast, they can no longer support this new features. And of course, as I said, time zones cost bandwidth, so you can't. They're not for free. Two more things that I'd like to add is that first of all, Moment has underwhelming support for durations. I think back in the day when Moment started off, people sort of didn't conceptualize durations that well so far. So the arithmetic and everything is a bit clunky, and I'll show you soon how good first class durations look like, which is something that we went on to fix later on. And another problem I have, and it's just really small problem, but I mean zero index months. I don't know how you think about months, but for me personally, January is always one and February is always two, not zero and one. So that's also an issue which we need to solve. So let's use Luxon. Quickly going over Luxon. Luxon does a lot of things. So Luxon has built-in time zone support through Intel. That's mostly a hack, but I mean, congratulations, you hacked your way into free time zones. So I mean, it's just free lunch for you from here on. It has immutability, so that's pretty bold and good. That's something that was really needed. And it has flawless daytime arithmetic. As I said, it's not rocket science to add better arithmetic, but Luxon kind of goes the extra mile and tries really hard for arithmetic functions. It interops really well with Intel, because uh, Luxon came after Intel was a fact. They sort of benefited from that, and it also has one index months. That's my favorite of them all. Talking about the complaints that I had, well, most of them no longer are valid. Talking about the parser behavior, well, I've got to say, Luxon's parser is fire. I mean, that's why I said that Moments parser is an 8, because Luxon parsers has to be the 10, and it parses the full ISO, it parses RST282, as I said, but it also parses HTTP headers. I mean, that is wild. Why did nobody predict that Express would be a thing and Node.js would be a thing and we'd need HTTP headers parsing? Well, that's wild. And parses SQL datetimes. Well, if you're a backend developer, I think you're going to really like, if you're building backend web applications and databases and HTTP servers, I think you'll like Luxon's parsing abilities. And of course, also custom formats like Moment and NoASP.NET JSON date. That's probably one of the nicest things. I'm kidding. I'm sorry. I'm such an asshole. Talking about the only problem that sort of still exists from my original list is non-existent calendar support. And actually, let me be a bigger jerk and add two more to the list. So first of all, Luxon has no nanosecond precision, and second of all, it's still a third-party API, so it still has some weight, and that weight, as I calculated on Bundlephobia, is 20.4 kilobytes minified in gzip. And I've got to mention, it's completely unfair to sort of levy these demands against Luxon. It's not, the ball is not in their court. Nanosecond precision is something that needs to be added on a language level, and I mean, even talking about the third complaint, that is something that also needs to be done on the language level, because a third-party API will always cost some bandwidth. So I mean, deal with it, Ujjwal. But it's just I'm just trying to be more thorough with the problems that still exist with Luxon, which sort of mandates that we still go on. The problems are not all solved, and we must figure out something else, which is let's fix date. Actually, let's go into the language and finally give developers something they need and deserve. I think JavaScript developers, y'all are the best, and y'all deserve the most amazing datetime API of all time. So that's what we've been doing for the last couple of years in total. And for me personally, for the last couple, uh, uh, close to a year, a little less than a year, I've been working extensively on this amazing proposal for JavaScript that would add such a functionality to the language, and it's pretty amazing. Let me show it to you. So I'm introducing to you Temporal today. Thank you. If you didn't know about Temporal, Temporal brings state-of-the-art datetime systems to ECMAScript. That's the plan that we have. It builds on the weaknesses of the old date object. So as I talked about, all those weaknesses that existed in the date object and even in the ecosystem proper, the problems with Moment and Luxon. Well, we try to fix all of them as much as we can, to whatever extent we can. It exists as a top level namespace object. So, as you know, there's an Intel object that has Intel.number format and Intel.datetime format and all that stuff. Well, guess what? We have temporal. temporal dot date, temporal dot time, all that stuff. It brings capabilities that were previously impossible to implement. If you remember from last slide, I talked about some really amazing things that were important, but they were impossible to implement if you don't do it on a language level. Well, guess what we're doing on a language level now? It's strongly typed, immutable, and it has a fault-tolerant API that's really hard to mess up with. So if you use something like TypeScript, for example, to make your typing stricter and everything, this proposal is something that you'll agree with more philosophically. Instead of introducing a big pie-in-the-sky temporal object, we sort of introduce smaller specific classes for dealing with it, strongly typed and all those things. It is highly extensible and customizable. As I said, apart from just being, higher level and giving people a lot of freedom and to do whatever they wanted without a lot of intrinsic knowledge, it also gives you sort of low level APIs to deal with the clunky yourself. Talking about a little briefly about the class structure of this proposal, there's an absolute class which deals with an absolute point in time. We'll talk about this later. And there's a date time class which deals with day-to-day date time systems, right? I mean, calendar day. What's the day today? What's the date today? What's the time right now? That sort of stuff. And well, of course, date time and absolutes can be converted to and from each other using time zones. So we have first class support for time zones. We have date. And time, which are broken constituents of date and time, and we have special cases for date, which is year, month, and month day. More on those later. But there's more to this, and I've not actually included that, and that's a surprise. Let that be a surprise for you. So moving on, talking about what do them classes signify? I just told you what the names are, but absolute, for example, it represents a fixed point in time. It has no concept of a calendar or location. As a matter of fact, all it is it's just a number of nanoseconds that have passed since the epoch in UTC. So it's a single moment in time. How many nanoseconds? That's how specific absolutes are, and that's how accurate all if you do very accurate time prediction or calculation, then that's the class that you'd like to use. I would think that most people would like to use absolute more than 70-80% of the time that they're using temporal. Think of it as an instant in time or a timestamp. I italicize these because these are two alternate names that we sort of decided for this class, and you can use whatever you like, and which explains it better to you. It can be converted, as I said, to a date time using a time zone, and it ignores leap seconds. I'm sorry for all you crazy hackers out there who have an atomic clock in your backyard. I don't. So sorry. For now, it ignores leap seconds. Well, a simple thing that you could do using this absolute class is you could get a Unix timestamp in JavaScript. This is actually the number one voted question in Stack Overflow, and well, you can just get the current absolute by temporal now absolute, and then you can get epoch milliseconds as you did in JavaScript date, or you can get the epoch seconds as is required on some systems with low precision. And now with new precision, you can even use epoch nanoseconds. And I think moving on in the future, that would be more of a thing. So it's future proof. Moving on to time zones. Well, time zones can either represent a IANA time zone, so that could be Europe slash Novosibirsk or Europe slash Moscow, something like that. Europe slash Madrid. It can represent a specific UTC offset, and when I say specific UTC offset, I don't mean -7 or plus 530. I mean plus 17, whatever you want. We have custom time zone supports. You can even include your custom time zone. So that's how good it gets. It can be used for conversions between absolute and date time. So that's how you move back and forth. And IANA names for each time zone, for example, Europe slash Novosibirsk, would have DST support by default. And offsets, of course, don't have them because they're always fixed. But if you use a well-known time zone, then you'll get all daylight saving data. And you can even just use this object to get the daylight savings transitions for a particular IANA time zone. So you can, get the next transition from today or something like that. You can get all the transition that happened from, 1970, something like that. So you can really go home with this API. Okay, what happened? Wild. Okay, let me quickly skip forward to where I was because I'm not sure why this happened. And okay, more. Okay, right. Absolute and then time zone. Cool. What? My slides aren't here. So, uh, well, actually, so that's the time zone class in temporal. And apart from that, as I said, there's the date time class. I don't think I have slides any longer for this, but let me try to improvise here. So we have the date time class, which can be, so think of date time as sort of a combination of two things, which is a date and a time. And well, the date is a calendar date, and a time is a wall clock time. So, I mean, if you ask me, hey, when are we going for dinner? I would not say, well, we'll go at dinner at 5 a.m. UTC. I would say we'll go at dinner at 8. And that's sort of how we perceive dates and times sort of in day-to-day life, right? I mean, and that's what a date time object represents. It has no concept of a time zone or a calendar in itself. Well, and what it does is that it just takes a local time in the current context. So it can be used for things like storing times on fitness trackers and all that stuff. Let me try if it works again. But, and of course, you can use this datetime class to break it into its constituent. Yeah, no, for some reason it doesn't work. I'm sorry. To break it into the components, so you can use the date separately, and you can use the time separately. And because these are not classes, weekly type classes, you can't mix them. So you can use dates and just compare dates with dates, and have a solid foolproof API that can help you work across dates and not have to bother about weird JavaScript behavior. Talking about year, month, and month day, those are sort of special cases in date, right? So, I mean, when you're talking about dates, there are some times when you talk about a date without a particular year or without a particular day, right? I mean, if you think about it, if I ask you when your birthday is, you will tell me, well, my birthday is on the 22nd of October. And you won't say which year because your birthday happens every year. Same with festivals or any sort of um, uh, annual event, right? So that's sort of the data model that is supported by year month and sorry, month day. And year month can be used for stuff like, hey, when did you uh, join a company or get married? Actually, no, you should remember the exact date when you get married. But I mean, your mileage may vary. So depending on that, you can use the special cases, which is the month day and the year month API. And I sort of had some examples in the slides where you can use that API to initialize the month day, and you can check, well, okay, here's my birthday for the next 20 years, and which year will my birthday will be on a Sunday? Well, guess what, in 2030 my birthday would be on a Sunday. So what a bummer. But I mean, you get the point. That's what these classes can be used for, and you can check out my slides later and see the examples for yourself. I'll also try to post some of them on Twitter for you. Okay, maybe now I can access the slides quickly. Okay, yes, perfect. Thank you so much to the organizers for having the slides again. So you see, that's how you construct a time zone from a YANA name. So you can get Europe/London, and you can get the name back from the. That's a rather simple example. Let's try more complicated example. As I said, date times is all of this. And talking about the example, you can get the current date in JavaScript. This is also a very popular question on Stack Overflow for dates in JS. You can just do temporal.now.datetime, and you can output the current date and time on, and date time are just half components of that, so they work as you'd expect them. year, month, and Monday are special cases, as I said. So that was the example that's not here. I'll post that example on Twitter later. Thank you for your patience. Talking about durations. So durations is something that I ranted a lot about before from Moment, remember? Yeah, because we have great support for duration. And durations expresses a length of time. So, you can have a duration which says, okay, 3 weeks. When is my uh, scooter arriving from the shop? Well, 3 weeks. That's how long it's going to take. And you can use, it's vital for arithmetic, so it's really cool. You can use it for all sorts of arithmetic. For example, you can store the date and time of my talk, and you can get the current date using this, and you can sort of difference that and find out how much time is left. And how do you represent that in a locale specific way? Well, how do you represent that by the minutes and seconds and everything written in Russian, and by all the Russian notation, using and in Russian, so you use e and all that stuff. Well, there's another proposal for that, and it's called Intel Duration Format. It's also something that I'm working on, and it's something I'm presenting that at TC39 in a few days, actually, day after tomorrow, something like that. And if you're interested in something like that, please hit me up. But I'll move ahead because I'm running out of time. One thing is we use ISO 8601 duration notation for parsing and representing that. So going head to head with Luxon, you see that we have inbuilt time zone support, we have consistent and sensible parsing like Luxon did, we have immutability, we have useful computation APIs, we utilize Intel for internationalization, we have first class duration and one index months. And we also have nanoseconds precision, which is something that Luxon doesn't have. So hey, we win, right? I mean, wait, did you notice what happened? Well, while calendar support appeared. So just to go over quickly, we also introducing support for calendar. This is the big surprise in temporal. I talked about the proleptic Gregorian calendar, which is the standard Gregorian calendar that we all use in our day-to-day life. January, February, March, April, all that sort of stuff. Well, we have first-class support for non-Gregorian calendars in temporal. This will include lunisolar calendars like the Hebrew calendar, or lunar calendars like the Hijri Islamic calendar. And Japanese, Chinese, all that calendar systems will be shipped. All the major systems actually through Intel, and all arithmetic respects the calendar. So you can add 1 month and it would just add one Hijri month, for example, if your date is in Hijri. So you don't have to do some date and then add one Hebrew month to it, add one normal month to it, and then see, okay, the Hebrew dates are not 1 month apart, because that's sort of bad UX. We also have custom calendar support, so you can implement any calendar you want. You can implement custom made up calendars, you can implement imaginary calendars, you can implement a calendar even for Mars, and you can do it through a simple calendar interface. So thank you so much.